Section 3 of History of the United States by Charles A. Beard and Mary R. Beard. Part 4, The West and Jacksonian Democracy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the United States by Charles A. Beard and Mary R. Beard, Part 4, The West and Jacksonian Democracy, Chapter 11, Jacksonian Democracy. The New England Federalists at the Hartford Convention prophesied that in time the West would dominate the East. Quote, "At the adoption of the Constitution," they said, "a certain balance of power among the original states was considered to exist, and there was at that time, and yet is among those parties, a strong affinity between their great and general interests. By the admission of these new states, that balance has been materially affected, and unless the practice be modified, must ultimately be destroyed. The Southern states will first avail themselves of their new confederates to govern the East, and finally the Western states, multiplied in number and augmented in population, will control the interests of the whole." End quote. Strangely enough, the fulfillment of this prophecy was being prepared even in Federalist strongholds by the rise of a new urban democracy that was to make common cause with the farmers beyond the mountains. The democratic movement in the East. The aristocratic features of the old order. The Revolutionary Fathers, in setting up their first state constitutions, although they often spoke of government as founded on the consent of the governed, did not think that consistency required giving the vote to all male adults. On the contrary, they looked upon property owners as the only safe, quote, "depository of political power." They went back to the colonial tradition that related taxation and representation. This, they argued, was not only just, but a safeguard against the, quote, "excesses of democracy." In carrying their theory into execution, they placed tax-paying or property qualifications on the right to vote. Broadly speaking, these limitations fell into three classes. 3 states, Pennsylvania, 1776, New Hampshire, 1784, and Georgia, 1798, gave the ballot to all who paid taxes without reference to the value of their property. 3. Virginia, Delaware, and Rhode Island clung firmly to the ancient principles that only freeholders could be entrusted with electoral rights. Still other states, while closely restricting the suffrage, accepted the ownership of other things as well as land in fulfillment of the requirements. In Massachusetts, for instance, the vote was granted to all men who held land yielding an annual income of £3 or possessed other property worth £60. The electors thus enfranchised, numerous as they were, owing to the wide distribution of land, often suffered from a very onerous disability. In many states they were able to vote only for persons of wealth, because heavy property qualifications were imposed on public officers. In New Hampshire, the governor had to be worth £500, 1/2 in land. In Massachusetts, £1,000, all freehold. In Maryland, £5,000, 1,000 of which was freehold. In North Carolina, £1,000 freehold, and in South Carolina, £10,000 freehold. A state senator in Massachusetts had to be the owner of a freehold worth £300, or personal property worth £600. In New Jersey, £1,000 worth of property. In North Carolina, 300 acres of land. In South Carolina, £2,000 freehold. For members of the lower house of the legislature, lower qualifications were required. In most of the states, the suffrage or office holding, or both, were further restricted by religious provisions. No single sect was powerful enough to dominate after the Revolution, but for the most part Catholics and Jews were either disenfranchised or excluded from office. North Carolina and Georgia denied the ballot to anyone who was not a Protestant. Delaware withheld it from all who did not believe in the Trinity and the inspiration of the Scriptures. Massachusetts and Maryland limited it to Christians. Virginia and New York, advanced for their day, made no discrimination in government on account of religious opinion. The defense of the old order. It must not be supposed that property qualifications were thoughtlessly imposed at the outset or considered of little consequence in practice. In the beginning they were viewed as fundamental. As towns grew in size and the number of landless citizens increased, the restrictions were defended with even more vigor. In Massachusetts, the great Webster upheld the rights of property in government, saying, quote, "It is entirely just that property should have its due weight and consideration in political arrangements." The disastrous revolutions which the world has witnessed, those political thunderstorms and earthquakes which have shaken the pillars of society to their deepest foundations, have been revolutions against property." End quote. In Pennsylvania, a leader in local affairs cried out against a plan to remove the tax-paying limitation on the suffrage. Quote, "What does the delegate propose? To place the vicious vagrant, the wandering Arabs, the Tartar hordes of our large cities on the level with the virtuous and good man." End quote. In Virginia, Jefferson himself had first believed in property qualifications and had feared with genuine alarm the quote, "mobs of the great cities." It was near the end of the 18th century before he accepted the idea of manhood suffrage. Even then he was unable to convince the Constitution makers of his own state. Urged one of them, quote, "It is not an idle chimera of the brain that the possession of land furnishes the strongest evidence of permanent common interest with and attachment to the community. It is upon this foundation I wish to place the right of suffrage. This is the best general standard which can be resorted to for the purpose of determining whether the persons to be invested with the right of suffrage are such persons as could be, consistently with the safety and well-being of the community, entrusted with the exercise of that right." End quote. Attacks on restricted suffrage. The changing circumstances of American life, however, soon challenged the rule of those with property. Prominent among the new forces were the rising mercantile and business interests. Where the freehold qualification was applied, businessmen who did not own land were deprived of the vote and excluded from office. In New York, for example, the most illiterate farmer who had 100 pounds worth of land could vote for the state senator and governor, while the landless banker or merchant could not. It is not surprising, therefore, to find businessmen taking the lead in breaking down freehold limitations on the suffrage. The professional classes also were interested in removing the barriers which excluded many of them from public affairs. It was a schoolmaster, Thomas Dorr, who led the popular uprising in Rhode Island, which brought the exclusive rule by freeholders to an end. In addition to the business and professional classes, the mechanics of the towns showed a growing hostility to a system of government that generally barred them from voting or holding office. Though not numerous, they had early begun to exercise an influence on the course of public affairs. They had led the riots against the Stamp Act, overturned King George's statute, and, quote, crammed stamps down the throats of collectors, end quote. When the state constitutions were framed, they took a lively interest, particularly in New York City and Philadelphia. In June 1776, the mechanics in Union in New York protested against putting the new state constitution into effect without their approval, declaring that the right to vote on the acceptance or rejection of a fundamental law, quote, is the birthright of every man to whatever state he may belong, end quote. Though their petition was rejected, their spirit remained. When a few years later the federal Constitution was being framed, the mechanics watched the process with deep concern. They knew that one of its main objectives was to promote trade and commerce, affecting directly their daily bread. During the struggle over ratification, they passed resolutions approving its provisions, and they often joined in parades organized to stir up sentiment for the Constitution, even though they could not vote for members of the state conventions and so express their will directly. After the organization of trade unions, they collided with the courts of law and thus became interested in the election of judges and lawmakers. Those who attacked the old system of class rule found a strong moral support in the Declaration of Independence. Was it not said that all men are created equal? Whoever runs may read. Was it not declared that governments derive their just power from the consent of the governed? The doctrine was applied with effect to George III and seemed appropriate for use against the privileged classes of Massachusetts or Virginia. Quote, how do the principles thus proclaimed, asked the non-freeholders of Richmond in petitioning for the state ballot, accord with the existing regulation of the suffrage, a regulation which instead of the equality nature ordains creates an odious distinction between members of the same community, and vests in a favored class not in consideration of their public services but of their private possessions the highest of all privileges, end quote. Abolition of property qualifications. By many minor victories rather than by any spectacular triumphs did the advocates of manhood suffrage carry the day. Slight gains were made even during the Revolution or shortly afterward. In Pennsylvania, the mechanics, by taking an active part in the contest over the Constitution of 1776, were able to force the qualification down to the payment of a small tax. Vermont came into the Union in 1792 without any property restrictions. The same year, Delaware gave the vote to all men who paid taxes. Maryland, reckoned one of the most conservative of states, embarked on the experiment of manhood suffrage in 1809. And 9 years later, Connecticut, equally conservative, decided that all taxpayers were worthy of the ballot. 5 states, Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, Rhode Island, and North Carolina, remained obdurate while these changes were going on around them. Finally, they had to yield themselves. The last struggle in Massachusetts took place in the Constitutional Convention of 1820. There, Webster, in the prime of his manhood, and John Adams, in the closing years of his old age, alike protested against such radical innovations as manhood suffrage. Their protests were futile. The property test was abolished, and a small tax-paying qualification was substituted. New York surrendered the next year, and after trying some minor restrictions for 5 years, went completely over to white manhood suffrage in 1826. Rhode Island clung to her freehold qualification through 30 years of agitation. Then Dorr's Rebellion, almost culminating in bloodshed, brought about a reform in 1843, which introduced a slight tax-paying qualification as an alternative to the freehold. Virginia and North Carolina were still unconvinced. The former refused to abandon ownership of land as the test for political rights until 1850, and the latter until 1856. Although religious discrimination and property qualifications for office holders were sometimes retained after the establishment of manhood suffrage, they were usually abolished along with the monopoly of government enjoyed by property owners and taxpayers. At the end of the first quarter of the 19th century, the white male industrial workers and the mechanics of the northern cities at least could lay aside the petition for the ballot and enjoy with the free farmer a voice in the government of their common country. Quote, "Universal democracy," sighed Carlyle, who was widely read in the United States, "whatever we may think of it, has declared itself the inevitable fact of the days in which we live. And he who has any chance to instruct or lead in these days must begin by admitting that. Where no government is wanted save that of a parish constable, as in America with its boundless soil, every man being able to find work and recompense for himself, democracy may subsist, not elsewhere." End quote. Amid the grave misgivings of the first generation of statesmen, America was committed to the great adventure. In the populous towns of the East as well as in the forests and fields of the West. The new democracy enters the arena. The spirit of the new order soon had a pronounced effect on the machinery of government and the practice of politics. The enfranchised electors were now long in demanding for themselves a larger share in administration. The spoils system and rotation in office. First of all, they wanted office for themselves regardless of their fitness. They therefore extended the system of rewarding party workers with government positions, a system early established in several states, notably New York and Pennsylvania. Closely connected with it was the practice of fixing short-term officers and making frequent changes in personnel. Quote, "long continuance in office," explained a champion of this ideal in Pennsylvania in 1837, "unfits a man for the discharge of its duties by rendering him arbitrary and aristocratic, and tends to beget first life office and then hereditary office, which leads to the destruction of free government." End quote. The solution offered was the historic doctrine of, quote, "rotation in office." At the same time, the principle of popular election was extended to an increasing number of officials who had once been appointed either by the governor or the legislature. Even geologists, veterinarians, surveyors, and other technical officers were declared elective on the theory that their appointment, quote, "smacked of monarchy." End quote. Popular election of presidential electors. In a short time the spirit of democracy, while playing havoc with the old order in state government, made its way upward into the federal system. The framers of the Constitution, bewildered by many proposals and unable to agree on any single plan, had committed the choice of presidential electors to the discretion of the state legislatures. The legislatures, in turn, greedy of power, early adopted the practice of choosing the electors themselves. But they did not enjoy it long undisturbed. Democracy, thundering at their doors, demanded that they surrender the privilege to the people. Reluctantly they yielded, sometimes granting popular election and then withdrawing it. The drift was inevitable, and the climax came with the advent of Jacksonian democracy. In 1824, Vermont, New York, Delaware, South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana, though some had experimented with popular election, still left the choice of electors with the legislature. 8 years later, South Carolina alone held to the old practice. Popular election had become the final word. The fanciful idea of an electoral college of, quote, "good and wise men," end quote, selected without passion or partnership by state legislatures acting as deliberative bodies, was exploded for all time. The election of the nation's chief magistrate was committed to the tempestuous methods of democracy. The nominating convention. As the suffrage was widened and the popular choice of presidential electors extended, there arose a violent protest against the methods used by the political parties in nominating candidates. After the retirement of Washington, both the Republican and the Federalists found it necessary to agree upon their favorites before the election, and they adopted a colonial device, the pre-election caucus. The Federalist members of Congress held a conference and selected their candidate, and the Republicans followed the example. In a short time, the practice of nominating by a congressional caucus became a recognized institution. the election still remained with the people, but the power of picking candidates for their approval passed into the hands of a small body of senators and representatives. A reaction against this was unavoidable. To friends of, quote, the plain people, like Andrew Jackson, it was intolerable, all the more so because the caucus never favored him with the nomination. More conservative men also found grave objections to it. They pointed out that whereas the Constitution intended the president to be an independent officer, he had now fallen under the control of a caucus of congressmen. The supremacy of the legislative branch had been obtained by an extra-legal political device. To such objections were added practical considerations. In 1824, when personal rivalry had taken the place of party conflicts, the Congressional caucus selected as candidate William H. Crawford of Georgia, a man of distinction but no great popularity, passing by such an obvious hero as General Jackson. The followers of the general were enraged and demanded nothing short of the death of, quote, King Caucus. Their clamor was effective. Under their attacks, the caucus came to an ignominious end. In place of it, there arose in 1831 a new device, the National Nominating Convention, composed of delegates elected by party voters for the sole purpose of nominating candidates. Senators and representatives were still prominent in the party councils, but they were swamped by hundreds of delegates, quote, fresh from the people, as Jackson was wont to say. In fact, each convention was made up mainly of office holders and office seekers, and the new institution was soon denounced as vigorously as King Caucus had been, particularly by statesmen who failed to obtain a nomination. Still, it grew in strength, and by 1840 was firmly established. The end of the old generation. In the election of 1824, the representatives of the, quote, aristocracy made their last successful stand. Until then, the leadership by men of, quote, wealth and talents had been undisputed. There had been 5 presidents: Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, all Eastern men brought up in prosperous families with the advantages of culture which come from leisure and the possession of life's refinements. None of them had ever been compelled to work with his hands for a livelihood. 4 of them had been slaveholders. Jefferson was a philosopher, learned in natural science, a master of foreign languages, a gentleman of dignity and grace of manner, notwithstanding his studied simplicity. Madison, it was said, was armed, quote, with all the culture of his century. Monroe was a graduate of William and Mary, a gentleman of the old school. Jefferson and his 3 successors called themselves Republicans and professed a genuine faith in the people, but they were not, quote, of the people themselves. They were not sons of the soil or the workshop. They were all men of, quote, the grand old order of society, who gave finish and style even to popular government. Monroe was the last of the presidents belonging to the heroic epoch of the Revolution. He had served in the War for Independence, in the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, and in an official capacity after the adoption of the Constitution. In short, he was of the age that had wrought American independence and set the government afloat. With his passing, leadership went to a new generation, but his successor, John Quincy Adams, formed a bridge between the old and the new in that he combined a high degree of culture with democratic sympathies. Washington had died in 1799, preceded but a few months by Patrick Henry, and followed in 4 years by Samuel Adams. Hamilton had been killed in a duel with Burr in 1804. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were yet alive in 1824, but they were soon to pass from the scene, reconciled at last, full of years and honors. Madison was in dignified retirement, destined to live long enough to protest against the doctrine of nullification proclaimed by South Carolina before death carried him away at the ripe old age of 85. The election of John Quincy Adams, 1824. The campaign of 1824 marked the end of the "era of good feeling," inaugurated by the collapse of the Federalist Party after the election of 1816. There were 4 leading candidates: John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and W.H. Crawford. The result of the election was a division of the electoral votes into 4 parts, and no one received a majority. Under the Constitution, therefore, the selection of President passed to the House of Representatives. Clay, who stood at the bottom of the poll, threw his weight to Adams and assured his triumph, much to the chagrin of Jackson's friends. They thought, with a certain justification, that inasmuch as the hero of New Orleans had received the largest electoral vote, the House was morally bound to accept the popular judgment and make him president. Jackson shook hands cordially with Adams on the day of the inauguration, but never forgave him for being elected. While Adams called himself a Republican in politics and often spoke of, quote, "the rule of the people," he was regarded by Jackson's followers as, quote, "an aristocrat." He was not a son of the soil, neither was he acquainted at first hand with the labor of farmers and mechanics. He had been educated at Harvard and in Europe. Like his illustrious father, John Adams, he was a stern and reserved man, little given to seeking popularity. Moreover, he was from the East, and the frontiersmen of the West regarded him as a man, quote, "born with a silver spoon in his mouth." Jackson's supporters especially disliked him because they thought their hero entitled to the presidency. Their anger was deepened when Adams appointed Clay to the office of Secretary of State, and they set up a cry that there had been a, quote, "deal" by which Clay had helped to elect Adams to get office for himself. Though Adams conducted his administration with great dignity and in a fine spirit of public service, he was unable to overcome the opposition which he encountered on his election to office or to win popularity in the West and South. On the contrary, by advocating government assistance in building roads and canals and public grants in aid of education, arts, and sciences. He ran counter to the current which had set in against appropriations of federal funds for internal improvements. By signing the Tariff Bill of 1828, soon known as the "Tariff of Abominations," he made new enemies without adding to his friends in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, where he sorely needed them. Handicapped by the false charge that he had been a party to a "corrupt bargain" with Clay to secure his first election, attacked for his advocacy of a high protective tariff, charged with favoring a "aristocracy of office holders" in Washington on account of his refusal to discharge government clerks by the wholesale, Adams was retired from the White House after he had served 4 years. The triumph of Jackson in 1828. Probably no candidate for the presidency ever had such passionate popular support as Andrew Jackson had in 1828. He was truly a man of the people. Born of poor parents in the upland region of South Carolina, schooled in poverty and adversity, without the advantages of education or the refinements of cultivated leisure, he seemed the embodiment of the spirit of the new American democracy. Early in his youth he had gone into the frontier of Tennessee, where he soon won a name as a fearless and intrepid Indian fighter. On the march and in camp he endeared himself to his men by sharing their hardships, sleeping on the ground with them, and eating parched corn when nothing better could be found for the privates. From local prominence he sprang into national fame by his exploit at the Battle of New Orleans. His reputation as a military hero was enhanced by the feeling that he had been a martyr to political treachery in 1824. The farmers of the West and South claimed him as their own. The mechanics of the Eastern cities, newly enfranchised, also looked upon him as their friend. Though his views on the tariff, internal improvements, and other issues before the country were either vague or unknown, he was readily elected president. The returns of the electoral vote in 1828 revealed the sources of Jackson's power. In New England he received but one ballot, from Maine. He had a majority of the electors in New York, and all of them in Pennsylvania, and he carried every state south of Maryland and beyond the Appalachians. Adams did not get a single electoral vote in the South and West. The prophecy of the Hartford Convention had been fulfilled. When Jackson took the oath of office on March 4, 1829, the government of the United States entered into a new era. Until this time, the inauguration of a president, even that of Jefferson, the apostle of simplicity, had brought no rude shock to the course of affairs at the Capitol. Hitherto, the installation of a president meant that an old-fashioned gentleman, accompanied by a few servants, had driven to the White House in his coach, taken the oath with quiet dignity, appointed a few new men to the higher posts, continued in office the long list of regular civil employees, and begun his administration with respectable decorum. Jackson changed all this. When he was inaugurated, men and women journeyed hundreds of miles to witness the ceremony. Great throngs pressed into the White House, "upset the bowls of punch, broke the glasses, and stood with their muddy boots on the satin-covered chairs to see the people's president." If Jefferson's inauguration was, as he called it, the "Great Revolution," Jackson's inauguration was a cataclysm. End of Section 3. Recording by Robert Scott, MojoMove411.com, December 2007.